Yes, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Can I do? Do I do co-host on your? Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right. Okay. So I want to thank everybody for coming to this California Division of Early Childhood members meeting. I know we're all busy and I appreciate everybody coming. My name's Amber Friesen and I am currently the president of California DEC. And we have many of our board members on here. So I don't know, do we want to just take a moment to introduce ourselves, or you could put in the chat also your name and position if you would like to. Maybe that's a good way of doing it, so that you can see who is our board. As part of that, I want to just plug the fact that we are going to, where an election is fast approaching, where there will be opportunities for other people to join the board. If you're interested, some of our time is ending and there's also a few positions that are open. So look out for emails about that. And we would encourage you to consider whether you would want to be part of this organization. It's a really nice group of people, I would say. And it also has such great potential as we continue to work with the national DEC and continue to think about our role in the state of California and how we can better support young kids with disabilities and their families, communities, and those of us who work with them. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our three presenters today. When we were thinking about having a members workshop that felt really relevant and important, immediately what came to mind were three people that I have had opportunities to get to know as both students in our program at San Francisco State. They're also educators, they're also colleagues now. A few of them have taught in our program. Some of them may continue in other graduate programs soon, or are in our doctorate program. And they're just also just very dedicated, kind individuals that I've had the pleasure of also presenting and working with over the last few years. So Karina, Tiffany, and Krystal, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to create this. We are going to allow them to present, of course, and then at the end, for those of us who are not board members or presenters, I will put your name into a raffle, and I'm going to say you might have a really good chance because we have some good books. And so I will put your name in, and if we choose your name, then we would be happy to send you a book. So stay on if you win, and then I will gather your address and we'll send you a book if you are interested. So with that, I'm going to let our three presenters also, I know that if in their slides, they also introduce themselves more thoroughly as well. So with that, I'd love to be able to hand it off to the three of you. Thank you again.
Thanks for such a warm introduction, Amber. It's great to see so many familiar faces and then also some familiar names. We're going to be presenting today on Beginning with Us, Strategies for Anti-Bias Education. So for our agenda today, we're actually going to start with a little bit of introductions. And as part of our introductions, we're also going to share about our positionality. Additionally, we're going to go through anti-bias education, working off of Derman Spark et al.'s anti-bias education framework, and then transition into supporting anti-bias practices. Really describing ways that we can think about what anti-bias might look like in our classrooms. And then Krystal is going to share a little bit about some specific classroom examples. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the very end for questions and comments and maybe just conversations. All right, so I'm going to start us off. As Amber mentioned, my name is Karina, and I'm currently a doctoral student in special education. I also work at the San Mateo County Office of Education as a project specialist for early learning quality and inclusion. I identify as an Asian American woman who is bilingual in Cantonese. I also identify as a first-generation college student and identify as middle class. I also come into this space with experience as a preschool general education teacher and special educator. So I'm going to pass it on to Krystal so that she can introduce herself a little bit more. Krystal, my dear, you're on mute.
Oh, hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Krystal Anderson. I am an alumni of the San Francisco State graduate and master's program, the graduate program, master's and credential. I identify as an African-American female who was monolingual, coming from a middle-class background and family. And I have experience working with students, preschool students and infants and toddlers who are high risk or diagnosed with a disability. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tiffany Enciso-Williams. I met Krystal and Karina through the San Francisco State graduate program in early childhood special education, and I've been working in early childhood classrooms for about 10 years. It's a big passion of mine. And I'm currently interning with PBS SoCal's early education team and freelancing as well. And I identify as LA native, as both Black and Latina, and as a specialist in early childhood.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, Krystal. So as part of our introductions, we also shared a little bit just about the various social identities that we each bring into the space. And part of the reason why we name our positionality is just in recognition of both our personal experiences, but also some of the social and political contexts that we also associate with our identity groups. And we ultimately recognize that this also influences just who we are, but then also the lens in which we approach our teaching, studies, and work. Additionally, we also acknowledge that some of these identities intersect, affording us certain privileges in some spaces, but then also creating some disadvantages in others. So this topic of anti-bias education really emerged for us as a passionate topic of ours, just again, in recognition of the various forms of marginalization that both we and our communities have experienced. So as we're going through our presentation, we'd love to invite you to just think a little bit about the different identities that you hold that might influence how it is that you approach your work. So I know that we have a small group today, and I know that the board has also shared a little bit just about their name and position. But if you also want to share a little bit about your location, and then maybe just a little bit about your favorite home cooked meal. Krystal, Tiffany, and I love food, and this is where we know that a lot of families and communities really come together to bond. So we would love to learn about that from you. So if you just want to drop that into the chat. And then Amber, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I think we're going to do the Slido activity. So I'm going to try this out, and oops, I guess that didn't come. If you utilize your phone and open up the camera and scan the QR code, it should take you to a Slido link. And if you enter the passcode 4144130, you should be able to get to a word cloud question. So we invite for you to share in 1 to 2 words what feelings or thoughts come to mind when you hear the term anti-bias education. The link is also on there, but let me quickly just drop it into the chat as another way that we might be able to participate. And I'm also getting hungry because I see eggplant parmesan. I also see macaroni and cheese. So a lot of yummy foods that are being named. So I'm just going to take a couple of seconds as people log on to the Slido. Are you all seeing my shared screen now? Is it still Amber's? Amber, I think you might need to stop sharing so I can show the Slido page. All right, so I'm beginning to see some responses come up. We see diversity, valuing cultures, a couple of, we're advocating equity, intentional, roots and wings. Equity is another big one that's coming up. Acknowledging and validating. Complex, yes. Welcoming. Inclusive. All right. Feel free to continue to add to it. I'm going to stop sharing. Amber, do you mind just bringing the PowerPoint back up? Oops. All right, so we wanted to just take a moment to kind of just acknowledge where folks are landing in the space of anti-bias work. We can see that anti-bias work is complex and there's a wide range of feelings and also experiences that come to mind when we think about engaging in the process. Amber, are you okay? Okay. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to dive into the anti-bias education framework by Derman Sparks. And this is a framework that can be utilized to create more equitable practices for young children and their families, just with the core notion and belief that every child deserves to develop to their fullest potential. Through anti-bias teaching, we're supporting all children in navigating a diverse world. And as educators, we also want to acknowledge that this work really begins with us. Anti-bias practices are just tools that we can utilize to examine, but also to transform how it is that we understand the lives of children, but then ultimately also engage in self-reflection just so that we can more deeply understand our own lives. So the 4 goals of anti-bias education include nurturing children's sense of identity. So really seeing children both as individuals who have their own temperaments and personalities, but also as members of different social groups and their families and communities. So this is inclusive of thinking about race, disability, language, culture, socioeconomic status, and et cetera. The second is teaching about human diversity and how it is that we can embrace our differences. Developing skills of empathy and fairness, so really working with children so that they can call out matters that are unfair. And then lastly, activism, equipping children with the tools that they need to stand up both for themselves and for others. So why anti-bias education? We feel like now is really a critical time for us to focus on equity in early education. Amber, you can go to the next slide. We know that the field of early childhood is normed around Eurocentric individualistic culture, and this fails to account for the range of identities that we see within our classrooms. And this is really thinking about the curriculum we use, child development theory, family engagement practices, and et cetera. We also know that biases begin in early childhood, and studies have shown that young children begin to develop and form concepts about identity, including biases towards racial groups, genders, skin color, other physical attributes, and et cetera. So we really need to think about how it is that we're supporting children in navigating their identities, including looking at differences and also biases in early education settings. And then when we are looking specifically at race, we also know that teachers of color are underrepresented in the teaching profession. So children of color might not always see themselves in their classrooms. So despite the fact that we know that research also shows that teachers of color can increase academic gains, decrease disciplinary outcomes, and then create more positive classroom experiences. And then SPED disproportionality. We also know that children of color are disproportionately represented across special education. For educational placements, white children are also more likely to have access to less restrictive learning environments. And then specifically for race and gender, African-American boys are also more likely to experience expulsion and suspension. So in naming these various factors, we know that inequities are manifesting and also being reproduced across our systems. And we believe that anti-bias practices are just a way and a set of tools that we can utilize to support our children and honor the array of identities that they hold within our classrooms. So I'm going to pass it on to Tiffany, who's going to walk us through another way of thinking about engaging in anti-bias practices.
Thanks, Karina. So how do we implement anti-bias education and combat some of the issues and challenges that Karina was naming? And one way we can do this is through an anti-bias framework developed to guide anti-bias work. And this framework is the framework for anti-bias teaching. It has 5 components: entry points, feeling, thinking, responding, and sharing. So what are children, teachers, and families thinking about? What feelings come up for you? What might be meaningful to explore? How do you implement a curriculum that supports learning? And how do you share this learning with children, families, etc.? So we're going to go through each component of the framework more in depth. So we're going to start off with entry points. This is what children, teachers, and families are thinking about. What is the anti-bias issue? So we recognize entry points, for example, by seeing and hearing what's going on in children's play. For example, you may hear only girls can be nurses. We can consider what we're hearing in the news, what we're talking about with families, or what we ourselves are thinking about. And it's very important to identify entry points with the understanding that anti-bias issues are not problems to be eliminated, but rather opportunities for teaching and learning. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here is an example of a possible entry point. The kindergarten teacher overhears her students say, "This is my ramp. This is a private ramp, and you can go up any ramp if you have a lot of money. People with a lot of money can go in anywhere they want." So the teacher is realizing that children are thinking about issues of ownership, resources, and power. The next component of the framework for anti-bias teaching is feeling. So for each potential entry point, educators must identify their own feelings related to the anti-bias issue. So you will consider how you feel initially, react initially, and respond based on your personal experiences. For example, you can go up any ramp if you have a lot of money. People with a lot of money can go in anywhere they want. So what feelings come to mind when you hear this? And there are no right or wrong answers, as it's a reflection of how you feel when you hear this. And encountering bias in the classroom can trigger a host of uncomfortable emotions, including guilt, anger, or denial. But if we don't take time to reflect on our own feelings, we may resort to quick fixes or avoidant responses. That's why this work is really important. Next slide, please. And the third component of the framework for anti-bias teaching is thinking. So we're going to think about potential next steps and what might be meaningful to explore with the children. You can consider, so you heard the entry points and you reflected on your feelings, and now you can consider planning individually with colleagues by doing more research about the topic, documenting what you see in the classroom, and getting different perspectives. So for the example given earlier, teachers began to look at power while they're thinking and discussing with each other. Teachers began to look at power as a way to consider acts of sharing and giving rather than having and holding, and developed activities around possible solutions to fairly distribute classroom resources and materials. And thinking is important because once you're in this work, you can identify multiple entry points. And one teacher admitted that it's still hard to set priorities and decide what aspects of all the potential discussions get attention, airtime, discussion. So this is where you come together and can kind of start brainstorming about which topics you're going to maybe move forward with in curriculum, resources, and in different ways that you can move forward. And the fourth component of the framework for anti-bias teaching is responding. So much of the work up until this point involves observing, reflecting, documenting, and questioning. And in the responding phase, teachers plan and implement intentional specific experiences. So what could this look like? With the kindergartners, you could have a discussion around words used during bike time, such as "I got it first," "it's mine," which we've all heard, and developing a plan together for sharing the bike, such as having a sign-up sheet. In the responding phase, teachers choose curriculum changes to implement in the moment and through long-term planning. So you consider how you could respond in the moment, respond long-term, or revisit and expand on the issue with children. And the last phase of the framework for anti-bias teaching is sharing. So how do you share anti-bias learning and communicate process and outcomes? How do you share it with your students, with children, teachers, families, colleagues, and the early childhood education field? So there's lots of different ways. Like this is one example of doing it, but there's lots of different ways with ongoing conversations with families, building those relationships with families. This could look like creating documentation to show the scope and depth of what children have been learning in the classroom. A gallery walk open to the public, presenting at a conference, and sharing with families through a newsletter, for example. And so these are the 5 phases of the framework for anti-bias teaching, and Krystal is going to walk through a way in which she has implemented that in her classroom.
All right. How do we apply the anti-bias framework? So this is just for your reference. It's just kind of a table that kind of shows the different 5 components, and it just gives you a quick summary of each one that you all can look at in your own time. Okay, so this is we're just going to kind of talk out an example that was used in one of the classrooms that I was at the school site that I was working at. Just so you're kind of familiar with what my school site looks like, it is a standalone preschool site. So there are 3 general education classrooms, and there was a special day class on this site. So there were 4 different teaching teams that came together to create the activity we're going to discuss. So when we think about the anti-bias teaching framework, we're first going to think about entry points. So in this particular experience with students, me and some of the other teachers in like a meeting, so in our staff meeting, we were talking about Latinx Heritage Month. And that was our principal at the time kind of emphasized the importance of Latinx Heritage Month and really started asking us questions about how are we going to showcase Latinx heritage in the classrooms with our students and families. So because of that, some of the other entry points that we thought of as a team was we thought about the demographics of our students. A lot of our students at the time were Latinx. We had some white students, we had some students who identified as Asian, we had some Filipino students, and we also had some Black students. So we really were thinking about, we have all of these different cultural backgrounds in our classrooms, in our families, and also in our teachers, but how can we really take time to really emphasize the Latinx heritage and culture, and how can we teach that to our students? So as an entry point, like kind of what we were thinking about was like, as a teacher, how can we really celebrate culture and be welcoming to all of the students, specifically the Latinx students that we had at this time? So when we move on to feeling, some of the feelings that just arose for me, or some of the feelings that I thought about when starting to think about the anti-bias framework, was how can I, as an African-American teacher, explore and engage students of other cultures? So when I first started thinking about this topic of like teaching about another culture, I had feelings of kind of just being inequipped, being unfamiliar with these cultural backgrounds, and really starting to think about like, I was kind of confused, like, how am I going to do this, knowing that that is not the culture that I grew up with, and knowing that I wanted to understand that culture and also honor the families and the children of that culture. So from having those feelings, then I went into like, I had a strong motivation to kind of learn about another culture and kind of teach others about a different culture. And then I also kind of reflected upon like my own experiences, my own personal backgrounds, and knowing that me as an African-American female, having the feelings of not being understood or seen in the curriculum and in the school system, just because when growing up in like my educational system, the African-American culture was not the culture of the majority. So it wasn't the history of like African-Americans was not something that was really spoken about as much while I was growing up. I had to take a lot of time to kind of do that work on my own and actively learn about my own culture. So those are some of the feelings I had when thinking about the entry points. So then from those feelings, I moved on to the component of thinking about like, what are the next steps going to be now that I've identified these strong feelings that I have, and thinking about like the planning, the documentation, like how am I going to teach another culture to these students? So what I started to think about was observations. So what are the observations of the students in the classroom? What type of food are they experiencing or playing with in the dramatic play area? What type of food are they bringing into the classroom? And what type of like things are the kiddos talking about in like the large group activities and just in their play? So I also thought about like discussions with families, like how can we have these discussions with families? How can we learn about what's happening at home, what's happening in their cultures and their backgrounds, the experiences that they have? And we also thought about like gathering ideas from teachers and deciding what is important to teach, what is meaningful. It's nice that at our site, we are so culturally diverse. There were a lot of teachers who are of Latinx descent. And we started asking questions. We started brainstorming like, hey, I'm having these feelings. What do you think the kiddos would benefit from? How can we create an activity that's very engaging to all of the students? How can we create an activity where they are all interested and excited to learn about a different culture that's different from their own? And then also, how can we make this accessible to all of our peers, knowing that there were multiple students in multiple classrooms that had disabilities and had IEPs, and we had a special day class. So how can we just make this something that we can all engage in? And we went back and forth. So I talked to some of the paraprofessionals, the teacher assistants, we talked to the different teacher teams, and we came up with an idea which would go into the responding component. So what we kind of discussed is one teacher was like, let's do a Taco Tuesday. And the rest of us were like, cool, let's do it. And then another teacher came and was like, okay, let's pair this with a story. And that teacher was looking for a story that really kind of emphasized or talked about the Latinx culture. We realized there weren't many stories that we could find that talks about a Latinx culture and food. So that's another story, but we couldn't really find that. So we ended up using the story Round as a Tortilla. We talked about making tacos, and we also talked about making a piñata from scratch, which the kids really enjoyed. And then we also, we had a celebration with all of the classrooms where they actually took time to sing the songs about the piñata and actually take time breaking it. And then after responding, we went into the sharing component. And this was just like, how are we going to share this out with our children, our families, our colleagues? Like, how are we going to tell people what we did and what our students learned? So we did this through photos, documentations of what students learned. We had bulletin boards, we talked to the families, and we could also do family activity extensions for home. Something we also had to think about was a lot of our families, English is not their first language. So we also had to think about like, how are we going to communicate or showcase this work in the languages so that our families could understand? Amber, you can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about what the activity looks like, which goes with the responding component. So what we did is we brought all of the classrooms together in one class and we really read this story. So we read Round as a Tortilla, and we were able to do it in both English and Spanish. So I was able to read the story in English, and I had another teacher who translated it into Spanish. So we went back and forth so that most of our students were able to engage in the content. You can go to the next slide. Then after that, we had all teachers in one classroom, which was great. All the kids were in one classroom, and we had multiple small group activities where the kids got to actually make tortillas from scratch. So one teacher found like these little miniature tortilla pressers, as you see in one of those pictures. It was the size for kiddos. So the kids made the dough for the tortillas. They were able to press the tortillas themselves. They cut up their own lettuce and tomatoes, and they cut up their cheese. We had them also we also cooked some taco meat for them to eat. And then the kiddos took turns watching their tacos be cooked on a little hot plate. And we took turns with the kiddos also making these tacos. So putting in what they cut and the meat, and really having the conversation about what were the steps of making tortillas and tacos? How are these used? What does it taste like? And really taking that time to learn about another culture through food. So within this, it was nice because all the students at the school were able to work together to learn about another culture while making these tortillas and tacos from scratch. And they really took time to understand what are the different steps that go into making a tortilla. What are the different steps that go into making a taco, and how can we really do this in a loving, community, welcoming way so that we're all here. We're all here, we're all having time together, and we're all kind of enjoying the activity. We can go to the next slide. So that was kind of the activity about the tortilla that we did as a group in the classroom. What this is right here is I provided some other steps and some other activities that could be done if you wanted to kind of talk about different identities and different races and different cultures in your classroom. This one is Black as a Rainbow Color, and what it does in your own time, you can kind of read the activity steps, and there's some extensions there of just how to talk about the color of Black skin, and talking about how that's not, in the book, it's talking about how in a regular rainbow, you don't see the color Black. But if you really take time to look at the different colors in different activities that we do in different items, Black is there, and Black actually is a rainbow color. You can move to the next slide, Amber. And these are two other books. So the first one is Eyes That Speak to the Stars, which is a very lovely book, just talking about kind of identity and family, and talking about the little boy's eyes. And then the second story is The Proudest Blue, which is talking about a little girl and how she wears a hijab at school. So those are just some examples of how you could use books, with different books that you could use that are more diverse, and how you can kind of use those in the classroom. Next slide, Amber. So now we're going to get into the what if portion. So thinking about the anti-bias framework and everything that we've discussed so far, I want you to just take a moment to kind of think about some of these entry points. So thinking about I don't like Black people. Oh, he's a baby. Think about if you have an experience with a Latinx children in your classroom who are not playing with Black children in the classroom. You can think about a parent saying, I don't want my child wearing heels and skirts. You could think about a kiddo saying, your skin is darker than mine. And you can think about boys don't paint their nails. So all of these are potential entry points that a teacher or professional could experience in the classroom. And now from this, we would think about how can we apply the anti-bias teaching framework to really support and and talk about these different teaching opportunities. So I think we still have a few minutes left, right? Yeah. Okay. So what we'll do together is I'm going to pick one of these statements, and we are going to talk and discuss as a group about how can we go through the feelings, the feelings, thinking, responding, and sharing components. So the quote I will choose, or the experience, is the situation. So we're gonna all think about this one experience about Latinx children. Oh, actually, no, we'll do this one. So we'll think about this quote: "Your skin is darker than mine." So let's think about that quote. And if we heard a child saying that in our practice or in our field, what are some feelings that will come up for us? You all can share that in the chat, or you can unmute and share those out loud. So again, just the quote is, "Your skin is darker than mine." If you had a child and you were working with them and they said that, how does that make you feel? What are some initial reactions or responses you might have to that child?
Krystal, I can see Emerald has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, didn't see that. Emerald, just go ahead and unmute yourself and share.
Not a problem. Good afternoon. As a individual that identifies as Afro-Caribbean with Latin influences, my family is from Belize, it's always been, and working in Southern California with the vast majority of my students being Latinx heritage, it's always been an ongoing conversation, and it's always been a point of interest for my students. Oftentimes, I've incorporated different activities that celebrate the complexions and tones of my students. So when it's often, "Teacher, your skin is very brown," it's always, and it's from pure curiosity. So we just go with that. Okay, so what do you think your color is? Often, in the last few years, I've gotten a lot of beige and tan, which I love. And oftentimes making sure that we have materials that reflect the students. So when they're creating their own image, they have the ability to do that and honor their own essence. And a lot of times with that, it's darker than mine or lighter than mine. It's more so that we're all on this grade of different colors and backgrounds, and that's what makes us important. But I love, for whatever reason, throughout the 10 years that I've been in early childhood special education, oftentimes I'll have a lot of my Latinx students that, "Teacher, I'm brown too." They're a different shade of brown, but that sense of camaraderie and community, that they're brown, I'm brown, just a darker brown, is more so them expressing that connection with me. And at the end of the day, the conversation is always framed around community and connection, as opposed to dark contrast. We're different, but we're the same.
Thank you so much, Emerald, for sharing that.
Well, hi, I agree with her. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge, that, yes, you're right. Your skin is darker than so-and-so, or darker than, or lighter than mine. And look at so-and-so. I was in the classroom for over 15 years, and then created activity with it. Of course, like she said, having that diversity paint or colors or, whatever, let's draw, and talk about the different tones that we all are, but we're all still, unique and special. I always used to add in, but what do you think I look like in the summer? My tone is not the same right now, and right now in spring, than it is in the summer. And they would always love investigating what, our tones would, skin would, how it would, darken, or depending, it would be red. I usually, I'm more, I have to first turn red and then get a tan. So we talked about that, and we, just made it an activity and included what happens, in different weathers, and our skin tone changes, but we're still us. We're still an individual.
Thank you for sharing, Josephina. So Josephina and Emerald kind of went through the framework. They went through multiple components. So when we talk about feeling, from those two experiences, what we heard was that there was an interest in like teaching this concept, there was a motivation to kind of have those conversations with the kiddos. So that would be kind of the feeling. When we think about thinking like this space that we're in right now, sharing these different feelings and really starting to talk about like, what are some next steps that we can do? And from what Emerald and Josephina were saying, we talked about how we can welcome all and be a community, how we can talk about the different skin tones, how we can have multiple activities, so modify our classroom environment so that the skin tones, the natural skin tones of our friends and our children and our families are being seen. So that went into the thinking, and that also went into the responding of just thinking about like, what are next steps? What are activities that we can have? So you all kind of went through the continuum of that component. The last part about it that we would just talk about is like, how will we share? So how will we share what the kiddos are learning in the classroom and what we've been discussing? How will we share that to families? How will we showcase their knowledge to their peers and to like colleagues?
I wanted to add quickly too that hearing these statements just reaffirms that, and research has shown that children are thinking about race and it's not a negative thing. And so just like everyone shared, you know, it's a teachable moment. It's, yeah, you're right. Like, how else can we talk about this? How else can we celebrate it? So thank you everyone for sharing.
Yes. Thank you all so much. And then, yeah, just for the last part of sharing, because I know we're running out of time, we can think about photos, documentation, and different ways that we can really communicate with our families, our peers, and our other teacher teams to just kind of showcase what the children and the families and your colleagues have all been working on. And then I just want to thank Josephina and Emerald for being those two kind of participants who really took time to express exactly your thoughts, your feelings, gave us a lot of ideas. So we really appreciate that. And I think that is, yeah, I guess we can go to the next slide, Amber. So anyone, these are just strategies for admin. So if there are administrators in the room in your own time, when you get to see this PowerPoint, you can review these strategies right here. Amber,
real quick, a comment on this too. I just want to say that as administrators in the room, this is very important, having support for educators, because as much as an educator can be passionate about this work, it's going to be so much more difficult if there isn't time and space and resources made available for them. So it's just very important to be supportive of your educators and supportive of this topic in your schools.
And these right here are just resources. So if you want to get more information about any of the topics or activities that we discussed, you can come to the resource page and really look up the information. And Amber, I am not sure how we are looking on time.
You're doing fine. I think
Oh,
we technically have it we have it right until 5:30 if you want to. So if you want, we can open it up if people have questions and comments for sure. Thanks, Krystal.
You're welcome. Okay, so if anyone had any questions or comments about what was shared, you can either put that into the chat or you can unmute yourself and kind of share out.